So this is kind of my first attempt at a more constructed history video. I actually sat down, took notes, and kind of organized more how I wanted to talk about a particular subject matter. And I figured since I'm just kind of starting off, I wanted to talk about the historical figure or the historical events that I personally know most about. So I am no expert. I am not the end-all be-all historian, of course. I personally just have an undergraduate degree. I specialize in studying contemporary European politics, mostly meaning European politics from the French Revolution onward, but my special area of studies are the 20s and 30s in Europe and right-wing nationalism, and then also studying how right-wing nationalism operates in modern-day Europe as well. So I want to talk a lot. I want to give a little biography of the historical figure I know the most about, which is Hitler. Hitler is kind of a historical enigma. He is one of the most well-known historical figures. I think most people know who he is, what he did, which I think is very important. But I think there is a thing that we have gotten wrong in society, and that is how we talk about the Nazis and Hitler in general. They are evil monsters, without a doubt. They are terrible. The Nazis were evil. Hitler was evil. I'm not erasing any of that, but we have kind of oversaturated our historical market with the Nazis, and now they have just become kind of the boogeyman, and Hitler is the historical boogeyman, and everyone who's evil is compared to him. And while it's not wrong, it's just that if you're talking about like the way that society conceptualizes historical events psychologically, oversaturating the market and very narrowly defining historical figures or events really kind of allows the public to form one singular view of events or people, and you miss a lot of the truths or the humanity within the situation. Now that sounds strange to say about the Nazis and Hitler, but I personally find it very important to humanize them and really look at the events as they took place and try to understand from a human level why they took place. And I think if we do that, we get a better understanding of the events, and it can allow us to not make the same mistakes in repeating them. Hitler was a regular man. He did not have a very even extraordinary background, but he was able to become dictator of a very small European country and take over almost an entire continent and start the deadliest war in all of history. So, you know, it's hard to understand how that happens, and I just kind of want to explain briefly his life, how he came to power, and how he fell from power. So I'm going to start off talking about his childhood. Hitler was born in 1889 to Adolf and Clara Hitler in a small Austrian town that bordered Germany. It would technically have been the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the time, but young Adolf grew up with a great admiration of German culture, literature, and music. Playing Wagner in the background right now. Personally, I fucking hate Wagner because he was an anti-Semite, but Hitler always admired him. Now, Hitler was not a very extraordinary youth. He did not really get along with his dad. His dad was a very, very, very strict, and he was very close to his mother. Now, something that I find that a lot of people have heard about, even if they don't know that much about Hitler's life, is that there's this rumor that's always existed that the chances are that Hitler was part Jewish. So, interestingly, there is a lot of historical evidence that does back this up. Now, Adolf Hitler's father was not born a Hitler. He actually took his stepfather's last name in the 1870s and changed it from Schrinkelgruber to Hitler. But his mother had him in 1837, and before his birth, she was a cook for a Jewish family. Now, when he was born a bastard, and his father was not listed on the birth certificate. So the origins of Hitler's grandfather are completely unknown. But there is a good chance, because she was a cook in that Jewish family, that one of them was the father. And there are a few things that do point to this being true. One of them being that in the 1930s, about 1930, Hitler got a letter, and it was very clearly intended to blackmail him, and had threatening, it was a threatening letter that was warning that they would release confidential and definitive information about Adolf Hitler's ethnic background. And 1930 would have been before Hitler was in power. The second thing that kind of hints to this would be that in 1938, when Austria is taken over by the Nazis, Hitler has his family graveyard cemetery where his grandmother and grandmother was buried bulldozed. So, you know, it could be true, it could not be true. Evidence does point to it likely being true, but it really doesn't matter. However, it would make Hitler a big hypocrite because under his own racial purity laws, he would have qualified to be exterminated had his grandfather in fact been Jewish. So Hitler, in school, had okay grades, was not a remarkable student. He was categorized as kind of a boy who didn't have a lot of friends and was kind of off daydreaming, and that does characterize a lot of Hitler's adolescence. When he was a teenager, his father dies, and then his mother does die later on in his teenage years of breast cancer, and that did really devastate Hitler. It was a sad point all of his life. But when he was in his late teenage years, he moves to Vienna, where he very famously is rejected from the Vienna Fine Arts Academy. Now, I think most people also have heard this, that Hitler was an art school reject, and he was rejected twice, not because he was a terrible artist, but rather they said his work was better suited for architecture. Well, if you look at them, I would have to agree. I mean, they're okay. They're not terrible, but they're not very interesting. And if you look at the other art that existed in Vienna in the time, such as Egon Schiele and Klimt, it's a very, very kind of traditional style that Hitler is chasing, and they're going more into the modern era. Interestingly, this art kind of taste Hitler had continued on, even when he was Führer. In his private art collections, all he had was really boring Germanic art, and he hated Egon Schiele and Klimt and all those modern artists. But when Hitler's in Vienna at this time, after he gets rejected from the Arts Academy twice, he's kind of bumming around. He has really no direction. He is described as everyone who met him as lazy and moody, and he's really doing absolutely nothing with his life. He starts painting postcards to make money. He's homeless for a bit, and he also has to then move into a youth men's hostel where he's surrounded by Jewish people, immigrants, and poor people, and he is miserable because he thinks he's above all this. One thing that people often say that Hitler said most of his early life, that he was going to be a great famous artist, and when he started to not succeed, he started blaming other people. Oh, I'm not a great artist, blah 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 blah. And very vitally, in this very unremarkable portion of Hitler's life, he is introduced to anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is not unique to the Nazis as far as European history goes. Anti-Semitism was something very deeply integrated into European society, particularly in Central Europe, in France, Germany, Austria. Germany and Austria historically have had very intense pogroms, which was a word often used for violence against Jews prior to the Holocaust. One famous example would be during the bubonic plague, where thousands of Jews were burned at the stake after they were scapegoated for causing the plague, and also in the Spanish Inquisition, Jews were attacked. Most Jews lived in ghettos for many, many centuries in Europe, where they lived literally behind walled cities, not interacting with the rest of society. Anti-Semitism was something very deeply ingrained and viewed as very regular for most of society. So Hitler, there's no real record of him being anti-Semitic in his early years before he moves to Vienna, nor are there any records indicating that his parents were particularly anti-Semitic, but Hitler had always admired Wagner and Martin Luther, who are both German figures with very strong anti-Semitic views. So, plus it was integrated in society. Hitler would have been familiar with it already, but at this point in his life, he starts actively reading anti-Semitic pamphlets on the regular, and he also is then introduced to a very particular ideology that had sprung up in the 1800s and then been later adapted in the 1890s, called Ariosophy. Now, Ariosophy is total pseudoscientific garbage bullshit, but Ariosophy believes in these ancient races, and they believe in things like Atlantis, and that these ancient races had different powers than humans of the contemporary day did, and the number one race would have been the Aryans, who were a mythological, Nordic-looking white people. It's total bullshit, but in the 1890s, when this Austrian guy, I can't remember his name, but he was adopting a work that had been written by a Russian woman a few decades earlier, and he adapted it to make it more racist. The 1890s are where you start seeing things like social Darwinism being very, very popular, and you also see the modern eugenics as you move into the early 1900s, the modern eugenics movement in the United States and Europe being very popular. So Hitler starts reading a lot of Ariosophy text by that one Austrian guy whose name I should have written down, but I didn't, and I couldn't remember it, I'm sorry. But he starts digesting all of this anti-Semitic material and all this white supremacist nonsense, and he really starts buying into it. So he's kind of continuing to bum around, but now he's just starting to ramble to random people about anti-Semitism and nationalism and Ariosophy, and he is really not liked by people. But Hitler, prior to his consumption of that literature, had friendships with Jewish people. He might have been anti-Semitic. That did not negate, the fact that you can be anti-Semitic and have Jewish friends. But, it's clear that his anti-Semitism, if he had had it before, really develops and grows as he gets older. Now, fate would have something in line for Hitler and the rest of the world. In 1913, Hitler moved to Munich in Germany, and he joins the German army there. Hitler had always, like I said, identified very, 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 very deeply with German culture and not Austrian culture, and he had always dreamed of moving to Germany and becoming a German. So while he's there, a year later, some monumental event would occur, and this is probably the most monumental event in all of human history. But the Archduke of Austria, Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist, and this sets off the First World War. Now, I could spend forever talking about why the First World War changes the world so much, or the difference between pre-World War I society and post-World War I society and the nature of the war, but I'll just sum it up. That war was the worst war ever in history. Just the conditions were awful. If you read anything about trench warfare or shelling, you'll know it's awful. But to briefly summarize, war had never been so destructive in all of human history. Tens of millions of people died in very brutal ways. Civilians died. Weaponry advances. It's crazy. Now, Hitler is kind of a message runner on the front, and that has an incredibly high mortality rate. People, have kind of incorrectly characterized him as a coward at this time period, but he actually was awarded an Iron Cross for bravery by the German Empire. So he was active in that war. So he would have been on the front line of an incredibly brutal, bloody, disgusting, psychologically damaging war. And in 1918, he is the victim of a very nasty gas attack. And he's then admitted to a field hospital far away from the front lines, where he is recovering from his injuries in the gas attack. Part of those injuries were that he had psychological blindness, so that it had damaged him so much psychologically that he couldn't see anything. And while he's in the field hospital, he learns that the German army had surrendered unconditionally to the Allied forces. So, something important to talk about. in conjuncture with this would be something that starts happening right towards the end of the First World War in Germany. Essentially, although Germany from 1871 after had unified to 1914 had been an empire, the war leads to kind of political chaos. Kaiser Wilhelm, who is leading the country, is not a very capable leader, and they're at a war, and it is engulfing them from all sides, and they need some stronger leadership, and they turn over to the general who is leading the German military at the time, Erich Ludendorff, and Erich Ludendorff becomes a kind of military dictator. He becomes military dictator of Germany for 2 years. So essentially, from the last 2 years of the war, Erich Ludendorff is in charge. But as the war is coming to an end, after he finds out his stepsons had been killed in battle, Ludendorff becomes very psychologically unstable and starts making erratic military decisions. So the Kaiser, although the Kaiser had just been a figurehead at this point, steps down, and he... doesn't step down. The Kaiser goes behind his back and surrenders to the Allied forces. Germany was going to lose the war at this point, and Ludendorff was just holding on for no reason. Now, Ludendorff is so angered by this, and he starts to tell people that he believes that the German army had been stabbed in the back. And this is where you are going to get the roots of fascism implanted into the German army. There is no fascism without the war. The war is the only thing that creates the political conditions to allow fascism to take hold. The anger felt by these soldiers who had gone and fought in an incredibly horrible, psychologically damaging war. They had had horrible wounds. Lots of soldiers in this war lost many limbs, facial disfigurements. Most soldiers suffered from a severe post-traumatic stress disorder, and not only that, Germany had been wrecked economically by the war, so they were coming home to a very poor country and had no job prospects, and they were very angry. And they listened to Ludendorff. They felt that they had been stabbed in the back. But Ludendorff does not blame the Kaiser. He does not blame the other Germans who had surrendered. He says that it's the Jews. And he says that it's the communists. In 1917, of course, there had been the Russian Revolution, where the Bolsheviks took hold. By 1918, when the war was over, Russia was out of the war and had started its own civil war, but the Bolsheviks were in charge there, and the Marxists were in charge there. And those are the people that Ludendorff blames. And this is being told to many soldiers on the front, and Hitler is one of these soldiers that starts buying into this. So on top of his philosophy of anti-Semitism and white supremacy, he is now buying into nationalism, and that brand of nationalism that comes out of the war. And those are three combinations of political ideas that are going to be carried by many, many Germans at this time, not just Hitler. It was a very widely bought into philosophy after the end of the war by many Germans. Now, after the war, political chaos is going to engulf Germany. In 1918, you see street fighting between the communists and the beginning of the far right that are born out of those soldiers I just mentioned, and they're street fighting all across the country. Now, part of the Treaty of Versailles, which is the treaty that ends the war, part of this is that Germany has to take full responsibility for everything that happens in the war. They're made to pay reparations to all of the countries involved. They are stripped of all of their colonies overseas, and they lose a great deal of land within continental Europe itself. Germany's economy had been wrecked by the war. By 1923, unemployment rates and inflation were skyrocketing. The highest unemployment rate Germany would reach during its economic crisis post-war would be about 30%, and inflation rate was about $1 to 4 trillion marks. So the country was also going through a tremendous amount of social change. The 20s are a period of social change, but throughout all of this chaos, you also see a modernization in thought by society. You see people moving out of rural areas into urban areas. They're starting to have relationships outside of marriage, and women got the right to vote. There is a huge nightclub scene forming, and even in Berlin, homosexuality becomes a kind of norm in society. But there's a schism. There's a very traditional part of German society who agree with the philosophy of Hitler, and then there is that modern left society. And all throughout the 20s, you're going to see these two sides bumping heads. Now, Hitler, after the war, is absolutely directionless once more, but he is still in the German military. And in 1919, he is going to be assigned to spy on a political organization called, one second, I think it's the DAP. So the DAP, the German Workers' Party. Now, they were not a left-wing organization. They were formed out of that group of soldiers who were angry about the end of the war and wanted to come together to share their grievances and talk about nationalism, talk about xenophobia, talk about anti-Semitism, talk about the anger they felt about having been stabbed in the back at the end of the war. And Hitler goes to these meetings, and he finally feels like he has found his place in society. And he, although he had been incredibly unremarkable up until this point in his life, finds his calling. He is, without a doubt, a fantastic, charismatic public speaker. Although he had always struggled in all of his other personal relationships, Hitler finds himself in public speaking. And early on, immediately, other people in the party recognize him as a great public speaker, and they start letting him speak more and more at meetings, and he's getting more and more followers in. And I think in the early days, about 1922, he garnered a crowd of about 5,000 people at one meeting. In 1920, the party would become the National Socialist German Workers' Party, shortened in its German form, the Nazi Party. And in 1921, Hitler would become leader of the Nazi Party. Now, in 1922, just south of Germany, in Italy, a very monumental event would also happen. In 1922, Mussolini would stage his march on Rome, and he would seize power of the Italian government, making Italy the first country to fall to fascist rule. Mussolini, very similarly, was inspired by anger that he felt after fighting in the First World War. And like I said, there is no fascism without that war. Like-minded ideals existed in the Italian army after the war, and Mussolini is actually the one who invents fascism. He crowns the term, and he deeply inspires Hitler. So in 1923, Hitler gets the idea to stage a coup himself. So, in November of 1923, Hitler, along with 3,000 other men, under the support of Erich Ludendorff himself, who I had mentioned earlier, stage a coup. They march into a beer hall where a political opponent is giving a speech, and they declare national revolution. And they are only successful in taking over a police station and a small government building, but all in all, around 20 people are killed in what is known as the beer hall putsch. And 16 members of the Nazi Party are killed, and 4 police officers are killed. And Hitler is marching, demonstrating, fighting for revolution while his brethren are dying around him. And this is going to become a great Nazi myth throughout the 12 years that Hitler is dictator. I have been to Munich, and I've seen where the beer hall putsch happened. The whole city still has this eerie, lingering feeling of Nazi energy that exists because it was so deep-rooted there since its beginning origins. It's really creepy. But Hitler ultimately fails, and he is sentenced 5 years in prison for treason. He only serves about 13 months in jail, but those 13 months are going to be very pivotal for Hitler, because in those 13 months he is going to write his very, very famous book, Mein Kampf, or My Struggle. In this book, he is going to accumulate all of his shitty ideas that he has been coming up with over the past few years of Ariosophy, super anti-Semitism, and nationalism and anger from the end of the war. Cool, my music died, but that's okay. Anger from the end of the war. So he pens all of this in Mein Kampf. And by the way, throughout Mein Kampf, Hitler does say how badly he wants to kill all the Jews. A lot. Throughout the whole book. And every German under Nazi rule was required to have this book. And interestingly, I had a professor who knew a Jewish man who had escaped from Germany. And he escaped in 1933, which was very early on, and she asked him why. And he said, when Hitler became chancellor, he read Mein Kampf, read all the parts about Jew killing, and said, well, I'm leaving. And he was very lucky. So that's why when people say, oh, they didn't really know, it was very much outlined from the beginning in the Nazi platform that they were very on board with wanting to murder Jewish people. So, Hitler spends time in prison, and his book, Mein Kampf, after he gets out of prison, does sell a lot of copies. Germany is suffering from political chaos. The Weimar government is the democratically elected government, democratic parliamentary government that's in power from 1918 to 1933, and it is really shitty and terribly run, and it is trying to lead through political chaos and through economic crisis. And in 1929, another monumental historical event was going to happen, and that was the stock market crash, which fucked Germany even more than it had already been fucked throughout the 20s. It hits them particularly hard. And that is going to be the turning point in the support for the Nazis. They had been gaining more and more followers following the beer hall putsch, even while Hitler was in prison. But after the 1929 stock market crash, the rates of people joining the Nazi Party skyrocket. In 1930, the coalition government that was leading the Weimar Republic collapses, and it leaves a power void. And through this, there's an election held where the Nazis are able to become the second largest parliamentary political party. Hitler realizes after the putsch that the only way the Nazis are going to be able to succeed in coming into power is through democratic means. And by 1933, by the January elections, the Nazi Party had already grown greatly in numbers. Hitler's ideas were very popular. This is not saying ever that every German was a Nazi, but it is very important to discuss the fact that Germans weren't brainwashed into this ideology. The children who are victims of being in the Hitler Youth, who were born after Hitler came into power, I'm not talking about them. But the reality is, most people in 1933 who were in the Nazi Party were adults who had willingly joined because they believed in its core values. And those core values were always outlined as fascism and white supremacy. Fascism and white supremacy do not always go hand in hand, but they come together and make Nazism. And there is no separating them. So everyone who supported the Nazis were white supremacists at this time period. There is more complicated things to talk about, like Jewish people who were early supporters of the Nazis, but like that's so fractional, and it's just a fucking straw man argument to be brought up in Nazi revisionism, in my opinion. But most people in the party were very willing participants who were white supremacists. So in 1933, in January, there's an election held, and there's a huge schism that still exists from all the political tension that was leading up to the 1933 election throughout over a decade, where the left cannot come together to agree on a platform. I'm not blaming them for the Nazis, but it is an important political component. The left cannot come together to agree on a platform, whereas the regular conservatives are more willing to go along with the Nazis. That is partially because they're not taking them super seriously and not taking Hitler that seriously. Throughout the 20s, Nazis were just viewed as right-wing thugs, and even when they came into the parliament, they weren't taken seriously. Hitler was not taken seriously, and the conservatives were really willing to bow to what Hitler wanted because they never thought that he would be able to take power. They figured they would be able to control him themselves. They really underestimated him. And the left, on the other hand, is made up by the Communist Party and the Social Democrats. Social Democrats are far less left-wing, and the KPD, the Communist Party, were Marxists and who were inspired by the Bolshevik Revolution. And they could not see eye to eye, and that does split votes. So in the 1933 election, Hitler is able to win a majority without, the Nazis are able to win a majority without, I can talk. The Nazis win without having one majority vote. They only have about 42% of the vote, and Hindenburg, who is president at the time, appoints Hitler as chancellor at this time because he is the leader of the party that just won the most votes. So, something critical is going to happen just a month later when Hitler is already in office, and that is that the Reichstag, the building that is the German parliament building, completely burns down. This is up for debate amongst historians whether the communists actually burnt it down or it was the Nazis, but the Nazis blame a Dutch communist that they found near the crime scene and say that the Communist Party, their number one political enemy in Germany, is responsible for the fire. Now, personally, me and most historians would agree that it was probably the Nazis who set the fire themselves, or if it had been the communists, they do use this to seize power. So Hitler legally declares under Article 48, a stipulation that existed in the Weimar Constitution, a democratic parliament. He declares a national emergency, and this in law in Weimar, Germany, if the leader declares national emergency, they had basically dictatorial powers, think like martial law in the United States. And it would suspend the parliament and give the ruler the ability to make any political decisions they want. So they declare that. And in March of 1933, the Enabling Act is voted upon. And the Enabling Act would agree to give Chancellor of Germany dictatorial powers for 4 years in the event of national crisis. And there is a lot of strong arming to get people to vote, but ultimately Hitler in March of 1933, through completely democratic means, becomes dictator of Germany. Now, the book where I've gotten a lot of my information from when I was in college, I read this book and it taught me so much, but I'm going to read you something that this author, who is a historian himself, who's written many books on Nazi Germany, quotes, something that I think is particularly important and particularly relevant, especially nowadays with what's going on in the United States and the threat by Donald Trump to declare a national emergency. So, Fest, who writes this book, Faces of the Third Reich, says, Hitler's path to absolute power, which has since been variously imitated, I don't have my glasses on, so I'm really struggling, sorry, imitated, remains in its several phases the classic model for the totalitarian capture of the democratic institutions from within. So, you can think about that and think how it could apply to our contemporary society. So Hitler by 1933 is dictator. Now Hindenburg is still going to be alive at this point, but in 1934 Hitler's going to be able to control Germany entirely. Two things are going to happen that lead to that. In 1934, Hitler's going to stage the Night of the Long Knives, where he assassinates about 150 members of his own political party. So throughout 1933, Hitler has members of the KPD and the SPD, his political rivals in parliament, arrested, and he eventually, after the Enabling Act, bans all other political parties outside of the Nazis. But he wants to get rid of any sort of dissidents within his own party, and he eliminates people, even people like Ernst Röhm, who were his closest allies, who had been in the Nazi Party since 1919, since they were not even the Nazi Party. He kills them all in one night, and he including, this is interesting, including the doctor who had been the doctor at the field hospital when Hitler was suffering from psychological blindness. So that is the first instance of mass violence really carried out in Germany. In 1934, Paul von Hindenburg, the president, also dies, and that enables Hitler to take total power over the country, because then chancellor and president are fused into one. And from 1934 onwards, Hitler will be total supreme dictator of Germany until 1945. And in this early days is when Hitler starts really, really, really amping up propaganda. And although I said that most Germans were, in fact, very supportive of Nazis, they definitely were. It was going to take an amount of propaganda to get people to buy into their ideas easily. You can't just commit genocide and, get everyone to agree on it at once. Even if they're anti-Semitic, you're going to have to take steps to really dehumanize Jewish people and really spread your political ideology. And part of what Hitler does is, and to maintain total power of, your people. If you're going to become dictator and want to have a totalitarian government, you have to maintain total and absolute and complete control of your country. So Hitler does this through a few ways. He is going to he's going to control the media entirely. He declared that the media were liars most of the time. Anytime he had been criticized in the early days before he controlled them entirely, or even before he had been elected popularly, he always said the Lügenpresse, the lying press. And then he is going to immediately establish upon his control, seizure of total control, a propaganda ministry led by Joseph Goebbels, and they're going to carry out an extensive propaganda campaign throughout Germany for many, many, many years. Now, Hitler also kind of is able to become this supreme being in Germany. The Nazis did not make up a majority of the country politically, but even if you weren't necessarily a Nazi, Hitler is greatly admired because he does do some things right for the German people. He does completely change the German economy. He lowers unemployment rate. In a few years, you go from 6 million unemployed to about 500,000 unemployment rate go completely down, and the economy turns around drastically. And he does it through a series of social programs and also kind of copies Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, where he gets people to go to work rebuilding the infrastructure of Germany. So he does gain popularity through his actions in that way, and that is where he does gain people who are more moderates, who are not conservatives. He gets them on their side. He also starts getting big industrialists on his side. He really is a master politician, and he knows how to get people to support him, even if they aren't ardent white supremacists. But he gets them to ignore that and see how it would benefit them outside of notions of white supremacy, and then he introduces white supremacy through a campaign of propaganda. But, of course, that propaganda is going to appeal to the great masses of Germans who were anti-Semitic. So, I'm sorry, let me just look through notes. Hitler's also going to, establish himself as a mythological being. This is where you're going to see him introduce the phrase, Ein Reich, ein Volk, ein Führer, which means one people, one leader, one people, one Reich, one leader. So it's totalitarianism and Nazism. You have to have, pure dedication to the state over yourself. And that's what Hitler is doing as he is becoming leader. He is kind of convincing the people to completely put the country and the leader above themselves. He is a nationalist, of course, and Germany becomes very, very nationalistic in the 20s, even outside of right-wing politics. Even outside of very, very conservative people and more moderates, you do see that sense of nationalism. You don't really see it on the left because they're more about internationalism because they're Marxist. But Hitler is going to, from this point onwards, slowly become more and more brutal. And in 1935, the Nuremberg laws are introduced in Germany. And the Nuremberg laws are the laws that strip German Jews of all of their rights as German citizens. It's important to note that German Jews were very deeply integrated into European society. They did not view themselves as Jews. Some were religious, but most were pretty secular, and most didn't really even think about their ethnic Jewish ethnic Jewish origin. They just viewed themselves as regular Germans. So for them to suddenly be viewed as othered and stripped from all of their rights, it was very sudden. And at this point, there is not a public outcry really at all by Germans, because they did really buy into the notions that the Nazis were putting out, or they were simply complacent. So in 1935, in the Nuremberg laws, you also see the first instance of violence perpetuated against the Jews. You see signs put up all across Germany to not shop at Jewish shops. Jews are getting beat up in the streets. Religious Jews are having their garb stripped off of them, their side locks cut. Jewish shops are getting their windows smashed in, and Jewish children are getting bullied in school, but they're not out of society yet like they will be in later on as eventually the Holocaust happens. But if you think about that, then Germans were completely integrated, so people would be living alongside their neighbors in apartment complexes who had not been anti-Semitic before the war, suddenly not be even willing to talk to their neighbors. It becomes just such a nasty society, and it just grows and grows, and this hatred that he implants in the people just grows and grows and grows and grows until eventually mass murder is committed. And by 1936, by 1935, Hitler is going to start breaking many of the laws that are set out in the Treaty of Versailles. He is going to start reoccupying the Saarland, which is a small region between Germany and Luxembourg, and the Rhineland, which is between France and Germany. And this completely violates all the laws set out in the in the Treaty of Versailles, which completely stripped Germany of its military, but the Allied powers are going to completely ignore this. And then in 1936, the Summer Olympics are held in Berlin, which is super wild to me. I've been to the Olympic Stadium, and it is just as fucking weird as you would imagine a Nazi Olympic Stadium is. There are big statues of weird, creepy Aryan men, and it's all gray concrete, like ugly, weird shit. But the games are held there, and Hitler is forced to watch his athletes get their asses kicked. He did ban all Jews from participating in the games, which, no one said anything about that, I guess. There was no international outcry, probably because most people were anti-Semitic at the time, and no one really cared. And they do go through great lengths to kind of hide their signs that say, hey, Jews, fuck off, or hey, don't go to Jewish shops. But Hitler does refuse to shake Jesse Owen, the famous black athlete who won 1 billion gold medals, hand, because he was pissed, because he wanted the games to show off the prowess of the Aryan race, and since that's total bullshit, they got their asses kicked. But more importantly, in 1936, Hitler makes his biggest move towards breaking the Treaty of Versailles, and that is because in 1936, a civil war breaks out in Spain between the fascist forces and the Republican forces, and Hitler immediately comes to the aid of Francisco Franco, the general leading the fascist forces in Spain. He is going to want another ally, of course, because he is eventually going to want to conquer Europe. He already has his ally in the other fascist dictator Mussolini, but he wants another one, and he sends a lot of money and a lot of troops and ammunition and military supplies to the Spanish. The very famous Guernica bombing, which Picasso made famous in his painting, is not committed by the Spanish. It is committed by the German Luftwaffe, or the German Air Force, and that is because Hitler wanted to use Spain as a military testing ground for all of his military equipment that he had been developing, and test out his soldiers, and test out the might of the military, because he starts rearmament, and his intended goal from the get-go was to take over most of Europe, because he wanted to bring his ideas of Aryan supremacy to Europe. He would have to conquer it, wipe out its people, so he could rebuild Europe with his white Aryan race. And to talk about this for a little second, in conjuncture with the idea of repopulation, the Nazis did have a program where they took young Aryan girls and SS soldiers. SS soldiers had to prove their racial purity back to the 1600s, and they all had blood type tattoos on their arms and wore little skull and crossbones and were disgusting motherfuckers, and they'd have them fuck in these like fuck factories, literal fuck, I'm sorry, that's what they were fuck factories, and they had these pure Aryan babies because the idea was you had to kill all the impure race and repopulate them with this pure German blood. It's super creepy. So Hitler starts testing out all of his military equipment, and once more, no one says anything because a very popular notion at this time was appeasement. They didn't really want to poke Hitler too hard because they were already suffering so much from the war that had already happened. The First World War fucks Europe so hardcore over. It is devastating psychologically, economically, and tens of millions of people die. It is devastating, and these people who were in charge lost their sons or had fought in war themselves, and they were desperate to not have that happen again. But Hitler's like, I don't really fucking care because I'm going to keep doing this and eventually conquer Europe anyways. So, flash forward to 1938. In the 1938, a few important things as far as Nazi history happen. In 1938, Hitler is going to have a very important meeting with the Prime Minister of England, Neville Chamberlain. And Chamberlain is very famous for his appeasement policy. And Hitler and him have these meetings where Hitler talks about wanting to conquer the Sudetenland, which is in the Czech Republic, because they have a lot of ethnic Germans, and he promises to not take over the rest of the country, and Chamberlain ultimately agrees because he doesn't want war on the guys that Hitler does not take over the rest of the Czechoslovakia. Guess what? He immediately takes over the rest of Czechoslovakia. Hitler also that same year marches his little troops over the border into his home country of Austria and annexes it and declares it part of the Third Reich. And the Austrians have always painted themselves as sort of victims, of which they weren't, because if you watch any of the videos of the Nazis marching into Austria, you see people fucking flipping out because they're so happy their prodigal Austrian son, Adolf Hitler, has returned. It's just really important to keep talking about the fact that everyone really fucking likes Hitler, because I hate revisionist history where they say that people were mass brainwashed. They just liked Hitler and loved anti-Semitism, and the ones that were not in the party didn't really do anything about it and kept their mouth shut, so they don't make them any better. But anyways, no one does anything about him marching his troops over to Austria. No one does anything about him retaking all of Czechoslovakia because they just don't want to go to war, and Hitler is getting really cocky and is like, cool, they're gonna let me keep taking over countries, I don't really give a fuck. But very devastatingly, in 1938 November, the first instance of mass violence against the Jews happens, and this is where you see a real turning point in the direction in which Germany is going to go, very obviously, which its Jewish population. And in 1938 of November, like I said, the Kristallnacht, or Night of Broken Glass, happens, and this is where Nazis smash Jewish shops, mass burn down basically every synagogue in the entire country, smash Jewish homes, beat Jewish people up, and arrest hundreds of Jews, and about 100 Jewish people are killed in this one night. And this makes international headlines, and no one really says anything about it once more. So the next year, Hitler's going to make two real key foreign policy moves. He's going to sign the Non-Aggression Pact with Joseph Stalin in 1939 that would agree that they would not go to war. The Soviet Union and Germany joined very briefly into a brief alliance where they split up Poland, because in 1939 Hitler's going to march his troops over the Polish border and invade them. And he thought he could get away with it, but this was the final straw for France and Britain, and eventually they do declare war. Chamberlain steps down, and good old racist but great wartime leader Winston Churchill becomes leader of England. But Hitler now is faced with a war that he has to deal with in Europe for the second time in about 2-3 decades. Is engulfed in mass war once more. But the first few months of the war are known as the phony war because nothing really happens. There is no real fighting. And in the winter of 1940, the Allied forces, Britain and France at this point, are driven out of France, and they are humiliated by the defeat at Dunkirk, and Britain has its forces evacuated, and then France basically is doomed at this point. France had lost a majority of their male population of breeding age in the First World War, so much so that their population suffered a very, very dramatic birth rate decline. So the men who would have been around to be soldiers at this time were simply never born because of the impact of the First World War. They didn't have enough troops to face the might of the German military and are forced to surrender in 1940 when they are ultimately invaded. Hitler is getting cocky and he invades most of continental Europe by 1940, but in 1941 he's going to make a real fucking stupid decision and he is going to invade the Soviet Union. At this point it was just Britain and Britain and Germany fighting each other in real bad air raids. But Hitler then's just like, I guess I'm going to invade the Soviet Union because that seems like a great idea. And he marches his troops over the border of Poland, which they had divided, and he starts taking over the East. And they do take over the East. That's the largest military operation in all of history. Also in December of 1941, Pearl Harbor is bombed, and Japan and Germany had entered into an alliance a little prior to this alongside Italy, and the United States declares war after Pearl Harbor on all of them, and they're all at war now, including the United States. So Hitler's military decisions start to become really erratically stupid at this point because he is a cocky little motherfucker and he thinks he can do no wrong. So he starts making really bad decisions regarding what to do in the Eastern Front. Particularly from 1942 to 1943, there's going to be a very fucking huge battle in the city of Stalingrad between the Soviet and Nazi forces. It's the deadliest battle in all of human history, over 1 million casualties, and Hitler does not let the Germans surrender, despite the fact that they are surrounded at all sides and very clearly going to lose this battle. Hitler's military decisions, since they suck, leads to their defeat, crushing defeat at Stalingrad. This is a turning point from the war. After this, the Nazis cannot win. That is the decisive blow to them overall, despite the fact that it will take 2 more years for them to surrender. There is nothing from that point that would save them, and this is the point where Hitler starts to lose a little bit publicly support of his people. Up until this point, he had been viewed as the king god of Germany, basically, and this is when people start really questioning his idea of supremacy, the 1,000-year Reich, and if the Germans can even win the war. There is a huge majority of people are still on his side, but this is where it starts to go downhill. So, at this time, Hitler's health also starts to really fail. I'm not talking that much about Hitler's personal life because it's not that interesting. He was not a very interesting dude. If you want to know anything about his personal life, in the early 30s, he had an affair with his niece. She killed herself. He started dating Ava Braun. That's it. He was a vegetarian for health reasons. He farted all the time. And he did have constant ailments. And because of those ailments, he starts being prescribed a lot of drugs, such as amphetamines, which are, if you know anything about them, meth is an amphetamine. So Hitler was essentially high as shit for the whole end of the war. And he's off his rocker, shaky hands, being a crazy motherfucker, and just making really bad decisions. However, in conjuncture, at the same time as Hitler losing his mind, something devastating is happening across Europe. In 1941, the Holocaust actually begins. I think people have an idea that it happens since Hitler's election to his death. It doesn't. It's from 1941 to 1945 is a majority of when the Holocaust is carried out. So you think about that, in those 4 years, the Nazis are able to commit genocide against 11 million people through extremely organized, brutal murder. It doesn't start off with the concentration camps, however. It starts off with these groups called the Einsatzgruppen, which were a division of the Waffen-SS, which were a particularly evil, racist incarnation of the Nazi military. The Einsatzgruppen were about 500 men in these battalions, and they went across Eastern Europe as the Nazis were conquering it, killing Jewish people by making them dig their own graves and shooting them en masse. An example of what one Einsatzgruppen did in the course of 2 days in the Ukraine, about 1943, they made 32,000 people in one area over the course of 2 days dig their own graves, and they shot them. And that is one unit of the hundreds of divisions of the Waffen-SS that existed under the Nazis. But ultimately, Hitler and the other upper echelons of the Third Reich do not agree that this is a really effective method in carrying out their ultimate goal, which had been basically, Hitler had toyed around with other ideas how to get rid of the racial inferior people in his territories, thought about deportation, thought about all of these things, but ultimately they decided, based on the earlier thing I mentioned in Ariosophy that he was buying into, eugenics, which is super popular in the United States, Hitler buys into that. So he starts a process of mass sterilization earlier on in the 30s towards mental patients, towards people who were mentally challenged, and then he's going to carry that en masse into the racial inferior groups of Europe. And this is when you have these mass sets up, the mass deportations from Jews across and people across Europe to concentration camps. There were tens of thousands of concentration camps across Europe, but the more famous death camps are all located in Poland. The most famous of which was Auschwitz, which was in southwestern Poland, and 1.5 million people would pass through the gates of just one concentration camp. 1.1 million people would die there in this one camp out of the thousands of camps that existed across Europe would die. At its peak of operation in 1943, 6,000 people a day at this one camp were being killed. You have to really stop to think about how many people died in the Holocaust. 11 million people is super hard to conceptualize, but it was mass organized death seen never before in history. Thank God we've never seen it since. There have been other genocides and mistreatments of minorities across the world throughout history, but nothing was as mass organized as this. And we know about the numbers of people that died because the Nazis themselves kept absolute meticulous records of the people they killed and of the steps through the Holocaust. People always argue Hitler never said killed the Jews themselves, but you can look through all the different documents online. I read them myself of different commands from various other people in the Third Reich. And Hitler himself has been quoted to say that this is himself saying, the ultimate goal must definitively be the removal of Jews altogether. He really was the architect of this. Now, he was running an anti-Semitic empire and had the support of millions of people. It's hard to talk about the Holocaust because I do think there has been a great deal of revisionism as far as placing blame on the Germans. And as I have said, not every German was a Nazi, but the ones that weren't were greatly complacent in the deaths of millions. There were people who were supporting the Holocaust, and there were those who saw their neighbors being arrested, who had heard their leader spout anti-Semitic nonsense for years, and then all of their neighbors who were Jewish disappear after they have had their rights taken away from them. You know, there are a lot of context clues. Kristallnacht happens, and even there are reports that make international headlines from the Einsatzgruppen that reach the rest of the world. The Allied leaders by 1942 knew about the Holocaust because the Soviet Union, who is having these Einsatzgruppen march through their territory, killing their Jews, tell the leaders the Holocaust was not as big of a secret as we have painted it out to be. No one knew the extent until the camps were liberated, and even for decades later, they didn't know the extent. I really don't even think we fully will ever know the full extent of the Holocaust because it involved so many people. But the reality is, most people had some idea of what was happening, particularly the Germans that lived in the parts of Germany that were near concentration camps. I have been to Dachau. Dachau is a town outside of Munich. It's about a 40-minute train ride. Dachau is a town that has a concentration camp in it. Munich is one of the most major cities in Germany, and it's a 40-minute train ride outside of it. It was not a real secret. You could smell people's bodies being burnt in that town. People knew, and no one did anything about it because they either bought into the ideology, were too scared for their own lives to say anything about it, or they were simply just complacent throughout the years that this unfurled. Now, there were small pocket groups of resistance, such as the White Rose. I have a tattoo right here for them. Or famously, the soldiers that tried to kill Hitler himself. But overall, there were very, very few instances of resistance throughout Germany. And that's because Hitler had gained mass control of his people. He had a secret police that went around arresting anyone who spoke out against him, even remotely, and killed them. And he had this mass network of propaganda. Hitler had complete and utter control of his people. Not to mention, anyone who had been born a little prior to 1933 or afterwards were forced to join the Hitler Youth and were totally brainwashed because they knew nothing outside of Hitler. So, by 1943, after the Stalingrad defeat, another defeat happens. Just in 1942, Hitler's troops had been defeated in North Africa, which left Italy particularly vulnerable to Allied invasion. And in 1943, the Allies invade Italy, and Mussolini, who had greatly inspired Hitler, is deposed as dictator. And this does frighten Hitler somewhat, although he is still a cocky fuck and thinks is invincible. But it does shake other members of the Nazi Party, and there does seem to be a little thread that is unraveling here. He is starting to lose loyalty amongst his people, and now he's starting to lose loyalty amongst his own military. And in 1944, there's going to be an assassination attempt against him by members of the German military. Now, these members weren't necessarily Nazis, but they were upper-ranking military officers, such as Klaus von Stauffenberg, who actually carries out the bombing, and even Erwin Rommel himself, a very, 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 very famous German general. And Hitler is not wounded. The bomb goes off in the Wolf's Lair. Hitler had not been spending that much time in Berlin. He had been splitting his time at this point between the Berchtesgaden, which is his home, and the really beautiful part of Germany. I've been to that area, the Austrian Alps. It's super gorgeous. He had spending time there or in his Wolf's Lair, which was more towards the Eastern Front, and he had been making a lot of his military decisions from here. So they placed a bomb in the war cabinet room, but they put it on the wrong side of the table leg, and it exploded. It killed a few people. Hitler was not wounded, but he in turn kills 5,000 people for participating in this, not all of whom were even involved, and none of whom who had real trials. If they were show trials. But Hitler is now struggling and grasping at this point to maintain the illusion of control. That is what's vital to dictatorships, is the illusion of control. And Hitler is feeling this slip away from him. Germany is now personally becoming more and more affected by the war, and people are starting to turn against him. They had elected Hitler and gone for Hitler because he had promised them to be great again. He had promised that he would return them to the former glory that they had had before the First World War. And now, after suffering greatly in one war, they are now starting to face a lot of suffering again. They are, there's food shortages. Germany is getting bombed by the Allied forces in great numbers, and more and more men are getting shipped off to the front where they are doomed to die. So it is not exactly ideal situations, although he does still have the support of a lot of very, very loyal Germans. But in 1944, the Allied force is going to land This is the largest amphibian. I'm a real cool person, I know. The largest military invasions were in history, but this is the largest amphibian invasion, and the Allied forces land in northern France in Normandy, and they are able to liberate France and make their way through Germany at the same time as the Soviet forces slowly progressing after the Battle of Stalingrad through reconquering the territory they had lost from the Nazis. The Allied forces are moving from France and Italy. So Germany at this point is becoming surrounded by their enemies. And Hitler is stuck in his underground bunker in Berlin, which, by the way, now is just a parking lot. I've also been there, and it's a weird, eerie feeling realizing you're standing on top of the ruins of Hitler's bunker. But Hitler ultimately realizes that the stick is up, and he is not really willing to capitulate. If you read any accounts of his final days, of the people who were in the bunker with him, he is super erratic. He is a shell of the man that you see at the Nuremberg rallies. I mean, the Nuremberg rallies are crazy to watch. That's when you see Hitler at his peak. He speaks in front of a crowd of 1 million, spouting off his Nazi ideals. This is about 1935. You watch Triumph of the Will, one of the most famous propaganda films ever produced. You see Hitler at his peak, and then you see or hear about the accounts of the shell of a man that is in the bunker. He ultimately knows he is going to lose the war, and right at the end of April, he hears that Mussolini had been killed and had his body hung upside down by meat hooks and had people throwing rocks at him in the streets of Italy, and the Soviet Union is now above him in the streets of Berlin, encroaching, and he decides that he is going to commit suicide rather than be captured because he doesn't want what happened to Mussolini to happen to him, and he knows if the Soviets get him, that will. So he decides to commit suicide alongside a few other upper-ranking Nazi officials such as Joseph Goebbels, who kills his 7 children, his wife, and himself, and then a few other people try to escape and or kill themselves. And Hitler gives his dog Blondie a cyanide capsule. His wife, Eva Braun, which he just marries on this night, takes the pill. She kills herself. Hitler takes a cyanide pill and shoots himself. And that is how the Third Reich really ends. On May 8th, 1945, the Nazis will sign an unconditional surrender, officially ending the Third Reich as a total. Now, Hitler then doesn't really die, does he? He dies, but everything he dreams of still lives on. He created this idea of Nazism, and Nazism is so pervasive still. It has never gone away, even after the camps were liberated. As the camps were liberated, by the way, speaking of that, the Allied forces in the East liberate Auschwitz in January, and they start releasing reports, and people aren't really buying this, except for when the Americans come to Germany and they come across the camps. And as the Allied forces liberate all countries, they realize that there is a mass network of death happening. They find the stacks of bodies. They find bodies still half burnt in the ovens. They find the crematoriums. They listen to the survivors. And it is after years that we realize that 11 million people were killed, 6 million Jews, a third of the entire population of Jews in the entire world, and 3/4 of every Jewish person in entire continental Europe were killed. Not only this, the Jewish population has never recovered from the Holocaust. The populations of Jews within Europe has not recovered. Poland had 3.5 million Jewish people before the war. Afterwards, they had less than 400,000, and that still remains even lower today. The Nazis were not, successful in killing every single Jewish person, but they succeeded in wiping out a culture from the continent. And Hitler got his way. His ideas never died, and that's what his final will and testament were, that he never wanted the ideas of Nazism to die, and that he wanted his work to continue even in the future after his death. And he has gotten his way. Right-wing nationalism, since it was born in 1918, has never died. And now we are coming about 100 years up on the anniversary of the first fall of a country to fascism, and we are once more turning to it. We are turning as a global society to right-wing nationalism once more, and that should terrify you, because if you've listened to any word I just said, all right-wing nationalism brings is death and destruction. Hitler was able to come to power entirely legally in a democratic country through laws that existed in a parliamentary democracy's constitution. It is not impossible to happen again. It is step one, like Fess said in the book, it is step one of any dictatorship to declare a national emergency and seize power. So it should be alarming that our president, who has embraced outwardly nationalism, has said he doesn't like globalism, who has been xenophobic, says he wants to declare national emergency so he doesn't have to listen to Congress so he can get his will. Now, I am not all for constantly comparing people to Nazis and Hitler, but when I hear things that directly echo things that have happened before in Nazism or in right-wing nationalism, history, it's my duty as a historian to fucking call it out and call it as I see it. And it's important for you as the public to be educated about the past on the subject so you can call it out when you see it in your country. His shadow embraces the world right now. Britain has Britain First, France has the National Front, Germany has Alternative for Germany. There is a self-proclaimed fascist serving in the Italian government right as we are speaking. There was a candidate who in Austria just narrowly lost, who was basically a neo-Nazi. There are extreme right-wing nationalists marching in Auschwitz on Holocaust Memorial Day in Poland because the Polish government is itself right-wing nationalist. It is happening all over again, and it is our duty as citizens of this world to look to the past, have an understanding of the past, and never let it happen again. Hitler and Nazis need to be understood from a human level, and you have to understand what compels people towards right-wing nationalism, so in our society, we can try to stop it from spreading. This was a kind of practice run of a video. I hoped you enjoyed it. I know it was mega long, and that I'm not perfect at speaking on camera, but it's something I want to get better at doing, so I hope you learned something or enjoyed this.